Taking a bit of a detour from our intended starting point, today we're looking at Wily Right No Rockboard, That's Paradise, released in 1993 for the Nintendo Famicom. The very same year that we saw Mega Man 6 bring the NES cycle to a close, as well as Mega Man X for the Super Nintendo. Now, while Mega Man 6 and Mega Man X left the land of the rising sun to grace international waters in some form or fashion, Rockboard stayed in Japan. As such, if you wanted to play this little-known Rockman title, you either had to get an import copy or go down the emulation path. A year or so ago, however, some folks managed to put together this Super 150-in-1 NES multicart thing, a masterful thing of beauty that cherry-picks some of the finest and rarest titles in the NES library. And it also has Rockboard in a somewhat translated fashion, and so there you go, Rockboard for the NES. Not quite an official release, but good enough for me. Without going into too much detail, Rockboard is essentially a board game where you and up to 3 other players go around 4 different worlds, buying up lots and building labs in an effort to lay claim to the most lots in the land. In essence, it's almost akin to the popular board game Monopoly. Lots are essentially your properties that you then build with houses and hotels, or in this case labs, while players landing on said property pays rent. So if you have some familiarity with the inner workings of Monopoly, then you should have a basic understanding of how Rockboard works. You have 5 different characters to play with: Dr. Wright, Dr. Wily, Dr. Cossack, Kalinka, and Roll. Each character has a different reason for winning the whole game, but otherwise performance-wise there's no real difference. They're essentially your tokens for the game. The various menagerie of familiar robot characters such as Rockman, Blues, and the various robot masters up to that point only appear via chance cards that you draw at certain points that has various effects on the game. In some cases, a player will transform into a robot master that will either have positive or negative effects on the game. There are also spots on the board that will bring up a little race between 3 little Mets that you could wager on, and if your pick wins, well, you win the winnings and stuff. And that's Rockboard in a nutshell. There's other details that I'm overlooking, but that's the gist of it anyways, and I'll be honest with you. There was a first time thrill playing Rockboard because I had never played it before, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't had an enjoyable time with this game, to the point where I spent a few hours on one session, which is rare for me these days. However, the second playthrough was considerably shorter. I only spent an hour on it before I lost interest. And what I got out of this game was that when you remove the Rockman/Mega Man association from Rockboard, what you're left with is a fairly mediocre and quite frankly uninteresting Monopoly derivative that I otherwise would not have touched or even considered looking its way. On the one hand, it is functional, it works the way it's supposed to for the most part, it is a relatively inoffensive little side game, and under the right circumstances it does make for a nice little party game if you get a couple of buddies along. But on the flip side of things, there is nothing in Rockboard that makes it truly worthwhile. It's a fairly slow-paced game that does little to nothing with the Rockman brand to enhance the experience. All of that is just window dressing for this board game that offers nothing special and really feels drawn out after a while. Again, there was that admitted allure to discovering why Rockboard never got a localized release here. There were apparently plans for it. But playing the game, maybe we never got this game initially because it just wasn't that interesting of a game. Remember, Capcom didn't publish Mega Man 6 for the NES in North America. That was purely a Nintendo release of a Capcom-developed game. Never mind the fact that Europeans didn't even get Mega Man 6 until the 3DS Virtual Console days. So if Capcom wasn't too keen on a mainline Mega Man game being localized on the NES around that time, then I can understand why they wouldn't want to release a bland NES derivative of Monopoly when there was already a bland derivative of Monopoly on the NES. It's called Monopoly, and it makes you wish you were playing the actual board game with actual people. And while we're on the subject of bland, Rockboard is perhaps one of the weaker looking Capcom titles on the Nintendo Famicom. Some of the mugshots are decent looking, even if some of them were ripped from previous Rockman titles, and the storyboards aren't too bad either, but the actual gameplay bits are just average looking. Bright, colorful, clean looking, little animated bits here and there, but just dull looking. I suppose there's not much you could do with a board game setting, but this could have used a little more something. I don't know, this whole thing feels like it was done on the cheap, and maybe it was, maybe that's the case, but I don't know, it's not really doing it for me. It doesn't really excite me or anything like that. Again, what can you really do? Yeah. Likewise, sound in Rockboard seems somewhat lacking. The sound effects in use here are the typical NES/Famicom Capcom quality sound effects that are perfectly suited for something like this, but the few music tracks that are featured in the game are weak sounding, lacking any semblance of energy or enthusiasm. It's not that they sound bad, but rather they're just meh sounding, almost forgettable melodies. I suppose for a throwaway board game type of thing, it's fine, but for a game in the Rockman franchise, a franchise that's known for its sizable collection of excellent chip music, this is a bit of a letdown and kind of unfortunate. Okay, here's the deal. As a curiosity piece and as something I've never played before, Wily Right No Rockboard That's Paradise was a somewhat enjoyable experience, and during the 3 to 4 hours of playtime on one Saturday night, like I said, one of the rare instances that kind of thing would happen these days, I could say that I had something resembling a good time with this game, at least initially, before the fun wore off after a while. That having been said, however, if I had gone through life never having touched or even heard of Rockboard, I would not have shed a tear. Rockboard might have been an interesting side game that's suitable for multiplayer parties, but it's really nothing more than a Mega Man take on a Monopoly style of board game, and not a particularly interesting one. It's probably worth a look for Mega Man fanatics who have been curious about this one, or just like playing relatively obscure games, in which case the aforementioned multicart is your best bet, but otherwise, just take it or leave it. It really doesn't matter.